The programme you're about to see is a history of the British Police Service. It traces the early origins of policing through to the formalisation of our current system in the early 19th century by Sir Robert Peel. Much of the film you will see has not been shown before. It's lain in police archives and records and not been seen by the general public. You will see police officers dealing with tremendous social deprivation of Victorian times. You will see them dealing with severe public disorder and some major crimes. What you will see throughout the film is police officers policing by consent, serving the community from whom they are drawn, and above all, I think at the end of this film, leaving you with a clear understanding of why your British Police Service still commands its reputation as the finest in the world.
Over 1,000 years ago, Anglo-Saxon kings ruled over Britain and expected the people to keep good order, which they called keeping the peace. Citizens were responsible for seeing that the law was not broken, and if it was, to catch the offenders themselves, or they risked receiving a fine. In time, it became the duty of every free citizen to take his turn as a local parish constable, serving for a year. The position was unpaid, and he was expected to combine his ordinary work as best he could. He had no uniform, but carried an official staff of office. The duties were not popular and often unpleasant, with the constable having little chance to do his normal job properly. Over the years, the population increased, and communities grew larger, so that policing, even at a local level, required constant attention. Consequently, well-to-do citizens with trades or businesses began to pay others to take over their policing duties. In 1663, the City of London began to employ paid watchmen to guard the streets at night. These men came to be nicknamed Charlies, possibly after the sovereign of the time, Charles II. The type of equipment they carried included a rattle, a lantern, and a staff, which provided their only form of self-defense. The tiny sums paid to them attracted men who were old and weak. Nevertheless, they were probably the most effective night police anywhere in the country until the end of the 18th century. In 1748, Henry Fielding became Chief Magistrate for Westminster, with his office in Bow Street, near Covent Garden. He realized that London needed a more permanent and efficient force than local constables, and recruited 6 householders to serve as constables for more than the usual term of 1 year. They still had no uniform, but they were paid a salary for working full-time, and became known as the Bow Street Runners. Henry and his blind half-brother John, who later took over his work, began a lifetime campaign to police London properly. As the Industrial Revolution transformed England from a rural to an industrial country, thousands of people left the countryside to look for work. And towns like Birmingham and Manchester grew at a staggering rate. Enormous numbers could not find employment and lived in the most appalling slums, with no protection by a welfare system. It was an atmosphere that bred crime. One of the greatest areas for theft in London was the River Thames, with merchant ships laden with expensive cargoes constantly loading and unloading at warehouses in the docks. Riverside workers and organized gangs were responsible for colossal losses. A sea captain named John Harriot and a London magistrate, Patrick Colquhoun, devised a scheme for policing the river and persuaded merchants to pay for a marine police force which started operating in 1798. The 60 or so salaried officers were armed with cutlasses for self-defense and operated from rowing boats. They soon became a respected law-keeping force and grew to be the largest regular professional police force of the time, joining the Metropolitan Police in 1839. The success of the River Police encouraged the growth of the Bow Street Police, and the Bow Street Horse Patrols were revived in 1805. In a typically British way, both Parliament and people distrusted the idea of a uniform professional police force and resisted any such move because of the threat to individual freedom. But attitudes were soon compelled to change. A great period of social unrest enveloped the country and culminated in a number of severe riots. In 1819, a troop of yeomanry charged a peaceful mass meeting of 60,000 weavers in St. Peter's Field in Manchester, killing 11 and wounding over 500. When rioting occurred, the local authorities called in the army, who were not trained to cope with riots and crowd control. The Peterloo Massacre, as it came to be known, helped accelerate the process of change towards the introduction of a professional police force. Sir Robert Peel, a skillful politician, became Home Secretary in 1822 and carefully made police reforms without arousing the public fear of intimidation. He believed in crime prevention rather than relying on punishment as a deterrent. In 1829, legislation was passed by Parliament to establish the Metropolitan Police in London, a single force for an area roughly within a circle of 7 miles from the centre of London. Colonel Charles Roane and Richard Mayne became Joint Commissioners with their headquarters in 4 Whitehall Place, known as Scotland Yard. The police constables wore deliberately civilian-style top hats and blue swallow-tail coats, and carried wooden truncheons and a rattle which they used to raise the alarm and call for help. Called the New Police, they also gained the nicknames of Peelers and Bobbies, after Peel. Recruits to the new force had to be under 35 years of age, be in good health and strong, and be at least 5 feet 7 inches tall, as Peel wanted his force to be a really good body of men. The Bobby was to be calm, quiet, and determined, as well as bold when he had to be, but above all he had to learn to keep his temper, however much he was provoked. Every recruit joined at the rank of constable, and promotion would only be given to those who earned it. From the beginning, the police force was a great success, but it took time for the public to accept the idea, and many brutal attacks were made against policemen. Reform was not limited to London, however. Other towns, such as Manchester and Cardiff, were actively forming their own police forces. One of the pioneer cities for the introduction of professional police was Glasgow, which has a claim to being the oldest police force in Britain, having paid policemen as early as 1800. In Ireland, Dublin and Belfast had formed town police forces by 1787. And in the same year, the baronial police began operating a body of untrained, part-time police over most of rural Ireland. The Constabulary Act of 1822 established a centrally controlled professional police force, which developed into the Constabulary of Ireland and then into the Royal Irish Constabulary in 1867. becoming the model for a number of colonial police forces throughout the world. When the government changed the way towns and boroughs were governed in the 1830s, they made it compulsory for every local authority to provide a professional police force. Some set up forces on the London model, but many rural areas were reluctant to meet the expense. Inspectors were appointed to visit every force and assess the standards to see if they would qualify for a government grant to help meet the cost. The lifestyle of the Victorian policeman was particularly harsh, and the pay was poor, about the same as a farm labourer, although it was better in some city forces. A constable would work to a system of shifts, which would mean 6 or 7 hours on days, evenings, or nights. Until 1868, he worked 7 days a week with no rests, which meant that many men became too ill to work. He walked his beat, patrolling the streets or lanes and meeting up with his beat sergeant at pre-arranged points, which was a kind of clocking-in system. The rural policeman was assigned to a village, and a special house was provided for lodging. They tended to integrate better within the community and became trusted and popular. However, the low pay tended to attract unskilled and uneducated people, and the public image of the average police constable was of a worthy but rather thick Mr. Plod. A major problem of the time was drunkenness amongst the public and the police themselves. Many of the original peelers were dismissed within 10 years for being drunk on duty. As well as arresting drunks, the constable had to cope with all manner of public duties, including fighting fires, breaking up fights, petty felony, as well as serious crime. The new police tended to be essentially thief catchers, not detectives, and they were often hindered by their uniform, which had to be worn even when off duty, and contained some diverse regional variations.
Essex are obviously proud of their traditions. This uniform has to do with a senior officer of the late Victorian period. The hat's a kepi, which was a French-type hat, but a working hat for the police, whereas ceremonial occasions they'd have worn helmets. You'll notice on the collar that I'm wearing, there are crowns. All ranks wore crowns. This had nothing to do with the modern practice of a superintendent using a crown. Constable would have had the same crowns as this inspector, and this is an inspector's uniform.
Glasgow Police appointed an officer to perform plainclothes duties early in the 19th century, and by 1887 the Glasgow Detective Department was considered to be the best in the country. In 1842, Commissioners Rowan and Main started a detective department at Scotland Yard, initially with 2 inspectors and 6 sergeants. Revelations of abundant corruption led to a shake-up of the force in 1878, and the detective branch was renamed the Criminal Investigation Department, or CID, as it's commonly known. By the end of the century, it had a strength of about 800 men. To assist the detective, Sir Edward Henry, Assistant Commissioner of the Metropolitan Police, set up the Fingerprint Section at New Scotland Yard, which became home of the National Collection, soon exceeding some 70,000 prints. By 1904, newspapers had reported of this potent new weapon in the fight against crime, a tool which is still vital today. Although there were some spectacular successes for the CID, the branch was bitterly criticised for its failure to catch the notorious killer, Jack the Ripper. One major hindrance in catching criminals was that many forces suffered from a lack of transport. Police, as a rule, walked, upwards of 20 miles a day in some cases. Probably the first police vehicles were horse-drawn prison vans, which were known as Black Mariahs, after Mariah Lee, a giant Boston negress whose size and strength was such that whenever there was trouble, constables sent for her to march people off to the cells. In 1903, the Metropolitan Police acquired two 7.5 horsepower Wolseley touring cars for use by the Commissioner and other officers. Gradually, cars were introduced into some constabularies, and in 1909, policemen were allowed to use bicycles to enable them to get about. This was the beginning of a new age of police mobility. Communication was a new area of innovation. 1910 saw the first use of wireless radio to trap a criminal, Dr. Crippen, who murdered his wife. Telephones also became more commonly used, and police phone boxes were built so that officers could quickly get in touch with their station. By the 1920s, some police cars were equipped with radio, and in 1926, the Metropolitan Police CID were using two-way wireless systems for communication between stations. During the first decade of the 20th century, it became obvious to luminaries such as Sir Edward Henry, by then Commissioner of the Metropolitan Police, that policemen would need training for the increasingly complex nature of their work. Even from the last century, police forces had been expected to train their own recruits, though there is no evidence that much training was ever given. The Royal Irish Constabulary was a pioneer in this field, with special education and training classes starting as early as 1899. By 1907, Peel House Training School was opened in London to train recruits in all the areas of police work. Another social problem that affected policing at the time was the women's suffrage movement, which was becoming increasingly militant. After chaining themselves to railings to get attention, they turned to smashing windows, setting fire to pillar boxes, and even bomb attacks. A particular violent episode in the history of British policing was the famous Sydney Street siege of 1911. Armed detectives arrived at number 100 Sydney Street in the East End looking for 3 anarchists who had already killed 3 policemen. A gun battle began which involved over 1,000 armed troops and police. The Home Secretary, Winston Churchill, had called for reinforcements, which included Scots Guards from the Tower of London, who arrived with a Maxim gun and a contingent of Royal Horse Artillery who came with 2 13-pounders. The anarchists appeared unharmed until just after noon, when some smoke appeared from the chimney of the house they were firing from. The fire brigade was called, but Mr. Churchill refused to allow them to intervene. The house burnt down, and afterwards 2 charred bodies were recovered. But one of the men, Peter the Painter, was believed to have somehow escaped. The problems the police faced changed abruptly with the advent of the First World War in 1914. As the war progressed, all police forces suffered a loss of experienced men who joined the armed forces. The void was filled by special constables, unpaid volunteers who performed many of the dangerous tasks that ordinary policemen took for granted. The Special Constabulary was an arm of the police which originally was only called upon in times of dire emergency. Under the command of Sir Edward Ward, a large force of specials was gathered to help on the home front during 1914. Tasks included guarding vital installations, stopping anti-German riots, directing traffic, and even manning anti-aircraft defences against Zeppelin raids. The specials performed their duties superbly, and after the war, a special bar was struck to be worn on the Special Constabulary Long Service Medal, bearing the words, "The Great War, 1914-18. It was also a time when women came forward in their millions to fill the gaps in the factories and other industries and to do their bit for the war effort. Women volunteered to take the place of policemen in some of the bigger cities, and by 1916 there were a small number of full-time police women. The suffragettes applied to become special constables, and under the leadership of Margaret Damer Dawson, the Women's Police Volunteers was formed. Their intention was to show just how useful women could be. If they proved their worth during wartime, the authorities would not be able to refuse them equality afterwards. Another body, known as the National Union of Women Workers, organized patrols to watch women's interests at military camps, railway stations, and anywhere else where licentious soldiers were likely to gather. It was not until 1919 that the Metropolitan Police Women Patrol was finally established as a branch at New Scotland Yard.
I think the main difficulty was the fact that most of them had no power of arrest, and so if they wanted to arrest anyone they had to go and find a policeman, which made things rather difficult. And also they had no truncheon to defend themselves with, so that the idea was that they'd probably be taken off them and be struck with them themselves. They had no representation from the Police Federation, who refused to recognise them, not until after the Second World War for England and Wales. And they had to resign on marriage.
In 1923, women in London were sworn in as constables and given the power of arrest. Outside London, some provincial forces also took women into the force at an early stage, such as Birkenhead and Glamorgan. The effect of the First World War did nothing to stop the dissatisfaction the police had over the issue of wages. During the course of the First World War, the cost of living doubled, but police pay stayed as low as ever. Trade unionism was on the increase generally, but the force was not allowed a trade union. So consequently, a strike was called on the 30th of August, 1918, although the war was still taking place. Traffic chaos was avoided thanks to bus and taxi drivers who did point duty during the rush hour, and prisoners were even taken to court in taxis instead of Black Marias. The demand for a union was denied. However, they did receive promises of better pay, pensions, and children's allowances. A second strike took place in July 1919, which led to serious crimes being committed in Liverpool, where one man was killed when troops opened fire to control looting. The outcome of the striking was that a union was not allowed, but a police federation was permitted, and pay was increased by about 30%. With it, the status and public image of the police grew. The various striking incidents highlighted the usefulness of horses in crowd control, and in the 1920s, a mounted training school was opened in Imber Court in East Moseley, Surrey. This was on the initiative of Lieutenant Colonel Laurie, who had joined the senior ranks at New Scotland Yard after military service in the cavalry. Horses had been effective with the Bow Street Horse Patrols and against the Chartist rioters, and several forces had initiated mounted branches. In 1900, the Chief Constable of Manchester had sought permission to establish a mounted unit, and Manchester also developed a role for a mounted special constable at a time of great shortage of regular officers. As well as helping to quell rioting, the police horse was used to supervise traffic and as a symbol of authority. In 1923, an event captivated the public imagination and proved the effectiveness of mounted officers. The FA Cup final between Bolton Wanderers and West Ham attracted 200,000 fans to Wembley, and the ground soon became dangerously overcrowded. Crowds climbed turnstiles and boundary walls, spilling onto the pitch and making play impossible. Organisers were afraid of a riot and were about to cancel the match when PC George Scory, on his white horse, together with other mounted police, averted a disaster by dispersing the invaders off the pitch and back to the stands and the surrounding areas. Bolton won the cup 2-0. With the police strike still a recent memory for many, the police were faced with the overwhelming task of policing the general strike in 1926. The strike began on May the 3rd after the Trade Union Congress decided to back the miners in their strike against pay cuts and longer working hours. A state of emergency was declared when the TUC called a strike of the nation's vital services. In London alone, some 60,000 special constables were enrolled to help. There were mainly volunteers who came from the middle classes, students, ex-officers and retired managers who saw the strike as a threat. There was not the expected violence, but in some areas the police were obliged to make baton charges and make arrests. There were instances of small numbers of police patrolling in all kinds of private vehicles, and police sitting beside bus drivers, themselves volunteers, protecting them from violent attacks by strikers. In 1930, police technology was becoming increasingly sophisticated in the bid to stop crime. The information room at New Scotland Yard, which was opened in 1934 thanks to Commissioner Lord Trenchard, was now fully operational. Similar information rooms were set up by many other large forces throughout the country, and they became clearinghouses for important information on specific areas. Regional transmitters were also constructed all over the country so that wireless cars could patrol in direct communication with their station. In 1937, the 999 emergency system was introduced in London, which cut police response time to incidents dramatically.
The receiving end of the 999 call. Speeding up the war against crime, a new information room to deal with emergency calls is opened at New Scotland Yard by Sir John Knott Bower, Commissioner, Metropolitan Police. Demonstrating the new system, here's a 999 call just being made. The woman has spotted housebreakers.
Police Scotland Yard. Yes, madam, this is information room. Your place has been broken into.
The result of all this new technology was that police time was not wasted, and their response time to get to incidents was much quicker, thus solving and stopping more crime. The use of motor vehicles became indispensable to police work, not only for traffic duties, but also for general mobility, and to catch the odd criminal who could make a quick getaway in his own transport. Police vehicles began to be fitted with fire bells, which the police called gongs, to warn the public of their presence when answering an emergency call.
The efficiency of motor patrols will not be judged by the number of convictions. We will be judged by the effectiveness of the manner in which we carry out our duties. You will now hear the police signal, which will be used only rarely and in an emergency.
Automated traffic signals, pedestrian crossings, a highway code, and overtaking lines on roads were all introduced. The majority of police drivers were not qualified to advise about driving techniques or able to uphold the traffic regulations. In addition, the accident rate for police vehicles was particularly high. It was evident that police drivers needed to have excellent driving skills, and in 1934, Commissioner of the Metropolitan Police, Lord Trenchard, opened the Hendon Driving School. The Earl of Cottenham and Sir Malcolm Campbell, two of the most famous racing drivers of the time, were appointed as civilian advisors. Their knowledge was passed on to police drivers for many years. By 1933, there were almost 3 million unemployed, 1 in 4 of the working population, One politician who developed his own solution to the severe economic crisis was Sir Oswald Mosley, whose use of violence during meetings and marches was deliberately provocative.
Mussolini has shown to the world a dynamic genius which has revitalized a nation. Hitler and the German movement now have the opportunity to emulate that achievement.
He blamed the subsequent disorder on Jews and communists, or red agitators from the ghetto. The thuggery, which became a familiar element in Mosley's British Union of Fascists demonstrations, resulted in greater police control over demonstrations and the cabinet rushing through a public order bill, which gave the police power to ban political demonstrations likely to cause disorder. The Hendon Police College was founded by Lord Trenchard in 1934 to deal with all aspects of police training, from those joining the force to those wishing to specialize within it. One of the centers opened at this time was the CID Training School.
An ace detective every day. This is the output aimed at by the Hendon Detective School. High priority in a detective's training goes to the identification of suspects with only a description to rely on. In this school, special attention goes to eye, brain and muscle coordination as part of Scotland Yard's master plan for combating the crime wave.
This is a way to tackle an armed man. Take it up. Now, a man rushing at the throat.
It looks too easy, but try it. It always works.
Trainee detectives went into the classroom to learn the tricks of their trade, like spotting the counterfeit coin made by the most professional of fraudsters, and how to use the most up-to-date fingerprint techniques for identification of criminals. Ballistics was also by now an everyday part of the anti-crime routine, with the discovery that a fired bullet identifies the weapon from which it is discharged, carrying its own telltale sign that can be spotted under a microscope.
Mary of Hendon is the world's most murdered model. In every test case, she is planted in obscure spots with well-hidden clues. The student detectives are brought in to collect the evidence under the experienced eye of a detective inspector. Here's how it goes.
Will you send for the doctor right away? And I want a photographer. And send a message to the superintendent. And I want some ropes around here with some stakes so I can rope all the hair off. Very good.
The discovery of the footprint of the man who struck poor Mary down calls for the taking of a plaster cast. After an initial spraying, plaster of Paris is poured into the depression. Left to harden, it picks up every detail of the murderer's shoe. Physicist, analyst, pathologist, serologist, and the expert in ballistics, allied with the 24-hour thoroughness of the detective. These are some of the odds against the lawbreaker. Detective Superintendent Rundle puts it this way.
Training and good perception, backed by modern science, put us one ahead of the criminal.
At Hendon, Trenchard also instituted a police forensic science laboratory. In the same year, Captain Athelstan Popkis, Chief Constable of Nottingham City Police, established a larger and in many ways a better equipped laboratory for his force in Nottingham. With the advent of the Second World War in 1939, those police who did not immediately enlist for service were being trained in air raid precautions, civil evacuation from attacks on cities, anti-gas drills, and specialized first aid. By midsummer 1940, and in spite of a state of war, all kinds of crimes became common, and new ones came into existence, such as the huge black market in ration goods. The police worked alongside the fire and ambulance services in helping the injured from the enemy raids and catching looters who took advantage of the situation to profit from others' misery. The specials once again played a very important role. not only patrolling and guarding vulnerable targets, but assisting rescue operations and aiding anti-looting patrols.
Before the war reserves can take over their full duties, they must brush up their training.
A policeman must always be courteous. He must never lose his temper.
Hey! Come on, get quick time. Quick time! Come on, settle down. Settle down. He's up, yeah. Come on, get right dressing. Hey!
Now, I am going to be the driver of the motor car. What is the first question?
Who is the registered owner of this vehicle?
Quite right. It must never be assumed that the driver is also the owner.
Presently the tempo of the war quickens, and more than ever the people come to the police station to clear up their worries and personal problems.
Oh, officer, I've just heard that my husband is a prisoner of war. Could you tell me how I could send him
officer,
a parcel?
I understand you want weapons of war.
Yes, madam.
That's good.
Here's some more for you.
It's a good thing Abyssinia's with us.
Apart from numerous other awards, the first George Cross was awarded to a special constable serving in Coventry. Police performed great acts of gallantry and self-sacrifice during the war years, with 293 George medals being awarded to men and women within both provincial regions and the Metropolitan Force.
Kent, a training school for London's police dogs, is opened by Sir John Knott Bower, Commissioner, Metropolitan Police, at West Wickham. Then a congratulatory pat for a star pupil, Rex 3, who recently arrested an armed man. A demonstration followed when puppies who'll grow up to help to prevent crime were put through their paces. Since the war, dogs have been making up for the shortage of manpower, and you must agree they make fair cops.
At the end of the war in 1945, many of Britain's vital services, which included the police force, found themselves lacking in manpower. It was for this reason that a year later, the Metropolitan Police set up the first properly organised dog section. Their usefulness in a wide variety of policing duties had been known for many years, and in 1954, the Met opened the first police dog training school. The male Alsatian soon proved itself as being the most suitable dog for policing needs, with its all-round abilities of skill, speed, and agility. Only 1 in 20 puppies show the temperament and physical requirements for the initial 13-week training course, which they begin when they are 1 year old.
Stay. Heel. Up. Stay.
Good boy. Let me remind you.
Becoming a dog handler is an equally difficult job, requiring hard work and a 24-hour commitment.
You have proved yourself.
The dogs are trained to be potentially dangerous, and it is essential that the handlers can stop them with their voice and keep up with the 8 stone of dog straining on their arms while running through woods and climbing over fences. The ideal dog handler, in the eyes of many forces, is a mature officer with several years' service, married, with a family and a home which is spacious and secure enough to prevent problems with the neighbours. Bringing a dog up in a family atmosphere is all part of the training, teaching the social skills necessary for dealing with people in the streets. During the police dog's usual 8-year period of service, he will often stay with the same handler, and the bond built up between the two can become very great indeed. Another important area of policing that benefited from advances made during the Second World War was the development of river policing, and in 1948 the Thames River Police celebrated their 150th anniversary.
150 years ago, the Thames River Police Force was formed, and in honour of the historic occasion, an old-time pageant and review was staged, and the handsome banners of the city livery companies were a decorative feature. Bloodthirsty pirates aped those days of long ago when the banks swarmed with thieves and rogues and plunder was the aim of them all. They were times of terror which disturbed the peaceful life of old Father Thames. But in 1800 they knew how to deal with offenders, and this ruffian was soon taken to task.
Regional police forces, over the years, have learnt to adapt to the specific problems of their own regions, such as the Oyster Fleet Police in Essex in the early part of the century. River police divisions have amalgamated and merged resources over the years, so that now there are approximately 10 marine police forces throughout the country. The power for today's police boats is provided by 2 large diesel engines capable of propelling the launch along at 20 knots, that's 25 miles per hour. The boats are equipped with the latest technology in the areas of communication, radar and navigational aids, and provide a watch 24 hours a day. As in the early days, one important duty is to combat the pilfering of cargoes from ships and wharves. They check and maintain a register of all mariners, keep an up-to-date lost and stolen marine index, and gather intelligence on boats and their owners. The Marine Police today are in close working contact with Customs and Excise, the Coast Guard and other police marine sections.
Haydock Park, Lord Derby arrived for the Lancashire Police centenary celebrations, and on the famous racecourse the Bobby of 100 years ago came back to life again. You'd be running wearing a hat like that today. A grand parade through the ages, 1839 to 1939, ended the interesting ceremony.
In the late 40s, police uniforms started to be modernized. Tunics with dog collar became V-necked, and the modern collar and tie was introduced. This changeover took some forces to the late 50s to complete, and numerous alterations for both male and female officers have occurred since. The policeman's number, which had been on the collar of the high-neck jacket, was moved to the epaulette. One recent change in uniform has been that officers no longer have to wear a coat or tunic when out on patrol. They may wear shirt sleeves. In order for the police to distinguish themselves from other services, the Scottish police, as early as 1932, came up with the idea of the black and white checkered hat band. This worked surprisingly well, and with the amalgamations in the late 60s and early 70s, was adopted by the police in England and Wales. The City of London Police has kept its own treasured identity, with a red and white diced band. The women police constable's uniform has changed considerably over the years. In 1968, a new uniform designed by Norman Hartnell was widely worn, though some forces, like the Cheshire Constabulary, did not provide their policewomen with uniforms until the 70s. And hard hats were not worn by policewomen until the mid-80s. Local taste remained a key to helmet design well into the 60s. Since then, constabularies have adapted either the Centurion Ridge or the standard helmet, although there were some innovations tried out in helmet design that didn't quite take off.
Grim reminder of the night of terror when the great floods ravaged Lynmouth last August is a memorial notice board marking the spot where 2 Australian girl visitors were swept away, together with the house in which they stayed. Lynmouth today is a proud village, as 3 policemen received decorations for outstanding bravery. The British Empire Medal for Police Constable Stanley Pavey, who within sound of the West Lynn River speaks of his award.
I would like to say how very pleased and proud I am to receive the British Empire Medal, and I'd like to feel that this is given to me on behalf of the numerous other people who did such splendid work on that awful night.
And a young village policeman, Derek Harper, is named a George Medal hero after saving 10 lives.
The honour of the George Medal has been bestowed upon me, and I do deem it a very, very great honour, both for myself and for the Devon Constabulary and police forces as a whole.
Let us have a look at the situation after the explosion of a high-yield nuclear weapon. The direction of fallout has become apparent.
Civil defence was still an issue in the 60s, despite the end of the Second World War 2 decades earlier. The acceleration of the arms race through the 50s was a direct response to the new hazard of nuclear conflict. The resulting Cold War between East and West led to the Home Office setting up a number of specialist organizations trained for dealing with the aftermath of a nuclear attack. One national scheme that developed was the organization of a police mobile column formed around a core unit of specialist vehicles. Exercises were developed in which officers living under military conditions learned how to rebuild vital transport and communication links, organize the movement of large groups of people whilst all the time staying self-sufficient. In 1970, women police constables were finally fully integrated into the police service. Before then, women police were still organized in a separate section called the Policewomen's Department. Their mainly social work duties included picking up missing girls and being sent out to deal with female offenders, so that if a woman was found shoplifting, a policewoman would deal with the arrest. Women police did night patrol work in club areas to prevent young girls getting into trouble. Sometimes they were loaned to the CID or uniform branch. The specialist aspect of the policewoman's work was not so rigid when she was out patrolling the streets, and like her male counterpart, she would have then to deal with anything that came along. The CID was taking on some women prior to integration, training them alongside the men in some detective duties. Women have also shown great bravery. They have performed decoy work to capture violent criminals, and amongst many George medals that have been awarded to the police over the years, Constable Margaret Cleland was a recipient in 1968. She stood on a high rooftop for over an hour talking to a man who threatened to jump off with his child in his arms. When integration arrived in 1970, the Policewomen's Department was abolished and the term Woman Police Constable, WPC, introduced. WPCs would now be trained in the same way as men and do the same sort of jobs. Policewomen nowadays are responsible for a wide range of police work. Although it is still difficult to get into the more macho departments, women can be seen on the front line at violent demonstrations. And some are trained to use firearms and work with armed response units. The risks involved in police work have proved fatal for both men and women. In 1984, WPC Yvonne Fletcher was shot dead while on duty outside the Libyan People's Bureau in London. Her abandoned hat was left on the pavement as a poignant reminder of the dangers involved in policing and the courage of those who assume such an occupation.
Pay-as-you-go parking has come to London's West End, and the Parliamentary Under-Secretary to the Ministry of Transport, Mr. Nugent, set the new parking meter scheme in operation. In goes his sixpence, and he's free to stay for 1 hour.
By the beginning of the 1960s, police forces were having to devote an increasing amount of time to the problems caused by the growth in traffic. There had been a general increase in traffic after the Second World War, which encouraged most forces to set up their own special traffic department. From the late 40s, a popular motorcycle for police patrol work was the Velocette, which quickly became known as the Noddy bike and served the police until the late 1960s. The fast growth of Britain's motorway networks in the 50s and 60s led to the requirement of more powerful vehicles, formed into units that often breached several neighbouring constabularies. To keep up with the faster-moving traffic, police constantly had to update their transportation. Ford Zephyr estate cars were converted to carry a full range of equipment used at the scene of an accident, and this trend of constantly updating patrol cars has become an ongoing concern.
More speed, in this case in the fight against crime. Police chiefs all over Britain are watching with great interest the experiment by Sussex Constabulary with equipment for transmitting messages, maps and photographs direct to patrol cars. So far, 6 patrol cars have been equipped with the system. The handwritten messages flash to the car for information. Back in the control room, a photograph of the suspect is fed into the transmitter together with other relevant details. This too goes over the air to the waiting patrolman.
The advances in police mobility, together with breakthroughs in communication, started to revolutionize the nature of policing in the 50s and 60s. The introduction of personal radio communication meant that for the first time the policeman on the street was in constant contact with the station and could be available to respond to an emergency at any given moment.
Constable Gray, Unit 6A for duty, Sergeant.
Sergeant Thompson receiving.
Reporting on duty, Sydney Road. Anything for me?
Mr. Stead of 37 Lime Avenue collect his dog from the station.
Wilco. I shall be down at the primary school about 11 o'clock, see if they've seen anything of that man with a telescope.
The pre-arranged beat pattern that the constable always followed could be abandoned and replaced by a discretionary beat. The new personal radios, known as bat phones, and the new police panda cars completely changed the face of policing. In the late 60s, the new system known as unit beat policing was introduced and involved the formation of small, well-equipped units policing small sections within a station's area. A constable would patrol with his bat phone in conjunction with a police car equipped with two-way radio. They allowed an officer to travel quickly from one part of his patch to another. Then there was an experiment with putting all police into cars, but it was a dismal failure. At a stroke, the close contact between the police and public was destroyed as the officer became totally isolated from the community he served. By the mid-70s, many of the old foot patrols were reintroduced in an effort to forge better relationships with the public. During the 90s, the Met went one step better and experimented with the reintroduction of bobbies on bicycles. This development was as much a result of London's growing traffic problems as it was a response to the need for increased community relationships. Crime was becoming more sophisticated in the 60s. The Great Train Robbery of 1963 was the biggest haul ever taken in Britain at the time. A Royal Mail van was stopped by a faked red track signal at a secluded spot in Buckinghamshire, and in merely 20 minutes the gang took 120 mail bags holding £2.5 million in banknotes, which were on their way to being destroyed. They left few clues for the police, who found one brown glove used to block out a green light and 4 large torch batteries which lit up the red stop signal. Not far away, the now notorious Leatherslade farm had been hired, in which the gang counted and divided the sacks of money. The flying squad was brought in to assist officers from London and Buckinghamshire, and a sophisticated police operation led to the eventual capture of many gang members. In 1966, the nation was shocked by the violent shooting of 3 policemen in Shepherd's Bush. Christopher Head and David Womble were shot whilst approaching suspected underworld gang members they had been following. PC Geoffrey Fox was shot as he sat at the steering wheel of his police car in front of a group of young children who had been playing in the streets.
And then another man got out of the car, started running on the road, and he shot him through the head.
He shot the man who was already down through the head. What happened then?
and then he smashed the window, I think, and then he shot the man in the car.
He had no time to radio to base, but before he died, he managed to scribble the registration number of the gang's car in his notebook. Days later, and amongst considerable media attention, the funerals took place, attended by officers from constabularies all over the country. Such was the shock and concern the killings provoked within the police service. Air support units are an increasingly important part of the modern-day police service. Yet the use of helicopters for patrol work had been established since the 60s. In 1963, Oxford City Police started to develop an unusual system of policing with the introduction of a very special member of the force. Danko, the flying police dog, was specially trained to apprehend criminals who had avoided the conventional methods of police chase. Without even having to land, Danko would be released from his specially constructed kennel and manage to surprise many an unsuspecting criminal. Regional police were experimenting with helicopter patrols over motorways as early as 1964. They made up a vital part of the new traffic division, introduced to manage the growing network of motorways in this country. For forces such as Devon and Cornwall, where there are large and often inhospitable areas to cover, helicopters are now an essential part of police equipment. Modern police helicopters can respond to incidents very quickly, such as surveying ongoing public order situations, and are equipped for such work with a system known as heli-tele, which can broadcast high-quality pictures. Today's helicopters can travel at great speed and are very useful in the pursuit of stolen vehicles. This area of crime has seen a massive increase in numbers over the past few years, with over 600,000 stolen cars in 1992 and only one-third of these recovered. Another problem which the police face with this new epidemic is the increased amount of teenagers and young offenders stealing cars. Joyriding, as it is more popularly known, has led the police to develop a new range of tactics to confront this extremely dangerous trend. Traffic departments have developed special training to respond to emergency police work, which involves pursuit driving. Selected drivers, chosen for their skill, are trained to drive the more powerful cars in the higher speed ranges in situations where it is necessary to exceed national speed limits. Of paramount importance is avoiding accidents and not putting the public at risk. The motorway sections of police forces are highly trained to deal with the free flow of traffic, the reporting of serious incidents, the examination of vehicles for defects, and the supervision of drivers. This is a section of the police service where constabulary boundaries may have to be crossed, and each force cooperates freely with the other in the interests of motorway safety.
He's crashed at junction 23.
In 1969, British troops were deployed in Northern Ireland after a week of furious sectarian fighting. Police used armoured water cannons and tear gas to disperse the crowds, but rioting continued, causing several deaths and hundreds of injuries. The situation has improved enormously since the beginning of the Troubles. when it was decided that the Royal Ulster Constabulary itself was an important cause of tension. As a result of this, it was disarmed, leaving the army to take over its riot control duties. This recommendation was accepted and largely implemented, but in 1971, when the current IRA campaign led to terrorist attacks on policemen, authority was given for the carrying of weapons for personal protection. The establishment of the RUC has since increased on several occasions because of the continuing terrorist campaign, and there are now 8,500 regular police officers supported by about 5,000 reserve officers. The difficulty and danger of the RUC's task of serving the community in the face of continuing terrorist violence is reflected in the hundreds of officers who have received awards for gallantry. Between 1969 and 1992, 286 members have been killed and 7,000 injured as a result of the security situation in Northern Ireland. The 70s saw some of the worst terrorist activity by the IRA on mainland Britain this century, and this put the police under tremendous pressure to get results. Along with explosions at tourist attractions like the Tower of London, where one woman was killed and several schoolchildren horrendously maimed, the mid-70s is infamous for the IRA bombings of pubs in Guildford and Birmingham, which were full of young people, 22 of whom lost their lives, and almost 200 were seriously injured. The Balcombe Street siege in 1975 was a result of an intensive anti-terrorist operation in central London. 4 IRA gunmen were cornered in a first-floor flat in Balcombe Street, where they were holding a couple hostage. The police immediately set up intensive surveillance activity as the Special Patrol Group, along with officers from D11 Firearms, consolidated their positions around the flat. To discourage any plans of an escape, dogs were kept within hearing distance of the terrorists and incited to bark. TV monitors were used to observe all key areas, and the balcony was watched day and night by C7 Special Equipment Unit. In a ground-floor kitchen, members of C3 Photographic also kept a constant observation. Silent drills, which could penetrate walls at 1 inch per hour, were used to insert sound and video probes from the adjacent flat in an attempt to improve surveillance of the activity in the hostages' lounge. All items lowered into the flat were carefully positioned to force the terrorists to handle them as much as possible in an attempt to obtain fingerprints for identification. After 6 days of skillful negotiations, the terrorists surrendered and bloodshed was avoided. Since the 70s, IRA terrorism has continued to test police resources. On one day in 1982, terrorists made 2 fatal attacks on the British Army in London. About 100 people were enjoying a lunchtime concert in Regent's Park when a time bomb planted under the floor of the bandstand exploded, killing 6 members of the Royal Green Jackets military band and injuring many others. 2 hours earlier, a car bomb parked in Hyde Park sent hundreds of nails across the road as a detachment of the Household Cavalry passed by on horseback. 2 soldiers were killed and many wounded by the murderous hail, and 7 horses were so badly hurt that they had to be destroyed. The police continued to pick up the pieces. In April 1993, the City of London was blown apart by a huge IRA bomb for the 2nd time that year. IRA terrorists drove a tipper truck loaded with explosives into the heart of the capital and then successfully detonated them, causing damage estimated at £500 million. After the second outrage, the City of London police force stepped up anti-terrorist activity by setting up permanent vehicle checkpoints inside the square mile. Lack of instantly available information had always hindered the policeman's work, not just in capturing terrorists, but in all areas of policing. In 1974, the first police national computer, known as PNC, was opened in Hendon in North London and provided the larger forces with instant access to criminal records. Its first facility was a record of stolen vehicles and owners from all over the country. It had previously taken weeks to check whether or not a suspect car had been stolen, and a visit was required to the local county hall to find urgently required documents. This information could be supplied instantly, and it was soon updated to provide lists of wanted and missing persons and a vast fingerprint index. The late 80s saw the introduction of a more powerful system known as PNC-2, which now allows forces to send vital information to other constabularies. If an officer thinks a murder suspect may be trying to leave the country, he can use the computer to alert forces at airports and seaports all over the British Isles. An extraordinary act of police bravery came about in 1980 as a result of the Iranian embassy siege. 5 terrorists had taken over the embassy and held many people captive when the SAS spectacularly assaulted the building, killing 4 of the 5 gunmen and rescuing the surviving 19 hostages. The assault became inevitable when the gunmen, demanding the release of political prisoners in Iran, started to shoot the hostages. The terrorist leader would certainly have killed the first SAS man into the building had he not been tackled by PC Trevor Locke, who had been on duty in the embassy when the gunman took over. PC Locke was a member of the Diplomatic Protection Squad, one of the specialist departments of Scotland Yard. The squad was formed in 1974 to guard foreign embassies in London and consists of about 400 men trained to use firearms. The CID within each force has numerous specialist departments to deal with very specific problems, like the drug squad, the fraud squad, and the serious crime squad. Special Branch is a separate department within the CID, whose duties include keeping tabs on organizations or individuals who are considered a threat to national security and performing bodyguard duties. An ex-Prime Minister once introduced his principal protection officer as the man who shoots the man who shoots me. In reality, Special Branch officers have seldom opened fire and never lost charge. The 1980s saw some of the worst outbreaks of civil unrest this country has ever known. In 1981, rioters in Brixton, Toxteth, and other areas fought with police and indulged in an orgy of looting, arson, and vandalism. Ethnic leaders complained of years of police harassment and racism. In Brixton, for example, the disorders were triggered off partly by Operation Swamp, in which the police flooded certain areas with officers exercising their power of stop and search in an effort to reduce the very high level of street crimes. The rioting became so violent and the police were so badly prepared that in Brixton they were using dustbin lids to protect themselves from missiles thrown by the youths. And in Toxteth, the police were forced to withdraw when they admitted that the mob had gone out of control. In the aftermath, Lord Scarman conducted an inquiry. His report drastically changed attitudes both to public order control and police-community relations, especially in the multiracial areas. And forces throughout the country were advised to set up community and police panels to foster closer links between police and public. These riots totally changed the way in which the police dealt with public order. Since 1981, police were given powers that the RUC already had, namely the option to use plastic bullets and tear gas as the last resort. Support units like the Special Patrol Group were now made available to be dispatched rapidly to scenes of violence. Police acquired special riot equipment and very rigorous training based on the tactics developed by the Hong Kong police. By the mid-80s, the Met had developed a riot city where they trained to deal with a variety of riot-related situations on a daily basis. The staged confrontations take place in a purpose-built maze of streets covering an estimated 30 acres. About 60 policemen and women take it in turns to play the role of law enforcers and rioters. All officers in the Metropolitan Force train at the city on a regular basis, and the site remains a chilling reminder of the dangers faced in modern policing. A new area of policing which developed in 1962 was the Underwater Seek and Search Unit to search for stolen property, vital criminal evidence and missing persons. These policemen have been especially trained to dive in a wide range of locations, often in dangerous areas where the risk of getting entangled in underwater obstructions is very great. For this reason, safety factors within the unit are very high. With a sophisticated communication system between diver and shore and careful handling procedures for any objects discovered. In order to retain as much forensic evidence as possible, items retrieved from the water, which often include loaded weapons, are handled with extreme care. Not all of their duties are carried out underwater. Often, the Underwater Search Unit is called to perform some of the less glamorous search duties, such as mud crawls, shallow water combing, and sewer searches. Full riot gear was worn by the police for the first time in 1984, when police from several different forces fought pitched battles with picketing miners outside the Orgreave coking plant in South Yorkshire. 41 policemen and 28 picketers were injured, and order was only restored after several charges by mounted police. Such scenes of mounted police galloping with batons drawn caused an outcry throughout the country. The police were testing out their new tactics. Firstly, lines of police carrying long shields were on the front line, taking the worst of any missiles hurled at them. These lines then parted and released either squads of police protected by shields and batons or mounted officers. The mounted section is probably the most effective police weapon, and often the last resort when attempting to control unruly and violent crowds. The miners' strike of 1984-85 saw a major manifestation of national policing. Although each force was still independently run, a chief constable could request additional police to be sent from other districts to help his own force. These police support units travelled in minibuses with a vehicle containing their riot shields, crash helmets and food stocks. The police came to be known as Maggie's Boot Boys by the miners, who accused them of taking the side of the government and employers and of using undue brutality against pickets. Many police, on the other hand, felt that they were being used as pawns in a political game between Margaret Thatcher and Arthur Scargill.
I said move. I'm saying said move. Come on, let's get moving. Get moving. Move. Get moving. Come on, go. No way. Listen, move. No way. Listen. No way. You're blocking the footpath. Right, arrest him then. He's under arrest.
I was standing at the top side of Orgreave coking plant, at the far end of a bridge, when the riot police began to charge. One of the police officers hit me at the back of the head and shoulders with the riot shield, and I lost consciousness. I think the scenes of violence down there from the police are almost unbelievable, but at the end of the day our pickets have stood up magnificently.
He fell from that bank, slipped more than fell, and his back sort of hit the ground and the back of his head hit what I think is an old railway sleeper.
Mr. Scargill says that he was hit by a riot shield from behind.
He wasn't near a riot shield.
The effectiveness of the mounted branch in policing riots proved that despite modern technology, old-fashioned aids to policing are still respected. Horses have always been used by the police. The acquisition and training techniques have changed very little this century. The most important factors have always been careful choice of animal at the right age and careful, patient training. This factor is equally as important for the riders who undergo a tough 8-week initial course, followed by continual training throughout their career.
And the care of saddlery and kit.
Once a suitable match has been made between horse and rider, the pair begin training together, experiencing a wide range of exercises designed to get them prepared for any situations that may arise.
The tallest horses that we have.
Oh, really?
Yes.
Once trained, mounted officers deal with the same range of incidents as other uniformed police during their patrol. One of the many benefits of the mounted officer is that he has the advantage of height for observation. He can also go where cars cannot, and is used to search areas like rough moorland and woods.
A horse on the beat is faster than a man.
Stop and stand where you are. All right. Just stay where you are. I want to speak to you regarding the property you've just taken out of that car. Okay.
A mounted officer is, after all, first a policeman.
Don't try running away. Okay. Papa Romeo from Mount...
In addition to crowd control, horses perform important operational work, like policing football matches, where it has been estimated that one horse and its rider can do the work of 12 foot constables. The mounted sections also carry out escort and ceremonial work, as well as entering competitions and participating in displays and shows throughout the UK. In recent years, the mounted section's increased involvement with policing riots has led to new training being introduced. Metropolitan Police horses take a regular part in riot control exercises and are trained to deal with the very harsh realities of policing in the 90s.
Wapping was probably the most violent riot I've ever been involved in. As a result of Wapping, we actually tooled up for the job. When I say tooled up, we became defensive. On one particular day we had 28 men dismounted. Not severely injured, but they were dismounted. Now you cannot allow that to happen in a public order situation. Your horses are your last line of defence. If your horses become ineffective, your next line of defence are rubber bullets and tear gas.
In 1990, a peaceful rally against the government's new community charge turned into massive riots when hundreds ran amok through central London, resulting in more than 500 demonstrators being arrested and many police and bystanders being injured. The community charge had been introduced early in 1990, and the public's disdain for the scheme had been growing steadily.
It's unfair. It penalises the poor, benefits the rich. It stinks.
Britain in recent times had never seen such a mass rejection of a policy, and this anger finally came to head on this eventful day. As had happened in the miners' strike and the civil unrest of the 80s, the police were the target for any aggressive action, being seen as the symbolic representation of government. The police, however, had suffered casualties in the 80s and were more prepared in the 90s. The majority of people who came to march that day had never protested against anything before. Such was the passion the poll tax aroused. A minority of militant groups, however, saw a great opportunity to incite the police, and the result was the worst case of civil unrest seen this century. Traditional methods of solving crime have gradually been overtaken by advances in science and technology. Facial identification techniques have been vastly improved by the use of computer technology and result in systems such as eFit, which allows the pasting together of a likeness on screen without any visible join lines, drawn from a photographic memory bank of many different facial parts. A witness is interviewed to obtain a description, and the details are entered onto an eFit form and transferred into the computer. New methods of fingerprint detection have been developed that will uncover useful prints from the most unlikely sources, such as objects recovered from seawater or waterlogged earth. In recent years, computers have eliminated the need for time-consuming manual fingerprint searches. The basic technology for automated fingerprint recognition, AFR, which is the storage and search of prints on computer, has been around since the 1970s, although not really adopted till the 80s. Kent was one of the first forces to use AFR, which allows a fingerprint to be checked against all those on the database in less than 15 seconds and can hold around 70 million fingerprints. The science of ballistics has come a long way since the 30s, and now scientists are able to use powerful equipment such as the electron microscope to identify unique chemical traces given off by the fired weapon. Possibly the biggest step forward in forensics in the last few years has been the growing use of DNA in police work. The odds of two people's DNA matching are less than 3 billion to 1, which makes it the perfect forensic weapon against crime. DNA can be obtained from the tiniest samples, such as a human hair bulb or a drop of blood, and its use within police work is really only in its infancy. Policing has always been a potentially dangerous profession, but the risks involved have increased over the years. A major problem the police face today is the increase in gun crime. The question is whether arming the police is a lifesaver or a liability. Would it be an effective deterrent to criminals acquiring firearms, or would it encourage more criminals to use them?
First of all, Minister, are you not saddened to have to see police armed with machine guns on mainland Britain?
Yes, I am. But I also feel very strongly that when the terrorists adopt new tactics and threaten, for instance, the terminals of airports around the world, then we must be on our guard and respond.
Guns are routinely carried by officers in nearly every other country in the world, but there is no proven cause and effect between an armed police force and low gun crime. Yet the problem is becoming increasingly serious. London saw only 4 armed robberies involving firearms in 1954. From April 1992 to March 1993, there were a staggering 3,000 armed robberies in the area and about 9,000 nationwide. Over the past few years, the way the police handle firearms has changed considerably. On the whole, the number of officers authorized to use guns has fallen sharply, but they are trained to a much higher standard. The Metropolitan Police cut the number of authorized users by 20% in 1992, and nationally slightly less than 7,000 officers, or 1 in 20, are authorized to use firearms. These smaller numbers are trained more intensively and tend to be deployed in specialist squads, including armed response vehicles, which are available 24 hours a day and carry a range of weapons. Today, the British drugs market is a fast, expanding business which draws on massive police resources. The mid-70s saw the increased use of cannabis and the beginning of well-organized drug distribution. By the mid-80s, it had become a world of heroin, cocaine, mainline criminals, violence, and regular use of firearms. Nowadays, cocaine seizures are running at 25 times the level of the mid-80s, and the use of crack, a highly addictive derivative, is growing fast. It is an expensive habit to fund and has resulted in a wave of crime such as burglary and car theft. The Police and Criminal Evidence Act, which came into force in 1986, gave the police wider powers in street searches, but added a safeguard by requiring a full record to be made.
Susie there, please.
Susie who?
Susie Nichols. She said she was coming up here to score. She's getting me some gear as well.
What's she look like?
Oh, she's got kind of,
It also gave police greater powers to search people's homes or to get doctors to make body searches of suspects for drugs or weapons. Stipulations were added that interviews at police stations should be tape recorded and extended the time people could be held before being charged or released.
Until he has been arrested, you will not be allowed any phone calls at all.
From the earliest times, the men and women who make up Britain's police force have had to learn to put up with criticism. Such are the problems of policing a democratic society. The police, however, do not make the laws, they only enforce them, and over the last 2 centuries have adapted extremely well to the ongoing needs of the people. Britain's changing social conditions have required the police to face difficult future decisions, such as the issue of carrying firearms and the amalgamations of small local forces.
Traditionally, if you look at the police service, it started off with local police forces, with local officers, policing people in distinct communities. With a small police force, you have leaders who are identifiable in that community. They have an empathy with the people they serve. And with this understanding, there is that feedback. They get to know what's happening, they get to understand people's feelings, and they also get to know if anything's going wrong in the police force. So I think that the small police force, really, at the moment, is our only way forward.
The main qualities of an officer are patience, because he has to be able to chat with people, and he must have a good mouth, because that is his main weapon to protect him in times of trouble. He has a truncheon, which is very little use these days, so he just has to talk, and many a rural officer has confronted an armed man and managed to persuade him to put down his weapon.
Well, I suppose most occupations have their humour and characters of their own, but the police are a little different. Many years ago, telephones, when they were first coming in about the 1890s, a telephone was put in one police station here in London, and the sergeant was heard to remark, next thing we'll be getting the public ringing us up on them. A long time ago we had 2 Indian brothers. I'll only cooperate if you have an Indian sergeant. So the sergeant on duty went into the back got hold of a red and white striped roller towel, wrapped it round his head as a turban, covered his face with it a bit of soot out of the oven, and came back. This amused the Indian so much that he started to cooperate.